and social justice advocate. She uses history to tell the truths and narratives of underserved populations in higher education, specifically as it pertains to levels of access for Black and brown persons and first-generation low-income students. Atiya's agenda focuses on mentoring, graduate education, and faculty diversity. She has published a book chapter titled White Faces in Black Places, HBCUs and the White Faculty Experience, and a forthcoming peer-reviewed article entitled You Are a Community, You Have a Practice, but Are You a Community of Practice? Reframing the experience of Black faculty at historically white institutions. Atiya was also recently selected to serve on an AERA panel discussing the next 100 years of doctoral preparation in education, and serves as the senior representative for Division F. Jason P. Murphy is a doctoral candidate in the Educational Theory and Policy Administration Department. He works the intersections of educational policymaking, anti-bullying policy, and queer equity. Jason's published in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education and the Texas Educational Review. Good for you. He has forthcoming encyclopedia chapters in the Sage Encyclopedia of LGBT Studies and the Politics of Education Yearbook, and what they're presenting today is also on its way to publication. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jason Murphy and Atiya Strothers.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming on a really beautiful Wednesday where you kind of want to get dragged outside. We're going to present on a paper an invited paper that we wrote in collaboration with Dr. Catherine Lugg, as well, called Jersey-Style Neoliberalism, Governor Christopher Christie, Crony Capitalism, and the Politics of K-12 Education. Before I get into it, I wanted to thank Randy for helping pull this together and working with us, being flexible, coming straight out of AERA into this, and Jamie and the rest of the tech crew for helping us set all this up and have the fancy schmancy slides so everybody can see. So first things first, what we'd like to do is talk briefly about the study and how the study kind of came to us. We'll give a backgrounder on Governor Christopher Christie, talk about our illustrative case study where we look to Newark specifically for this Jersey-style neoliberalism, and then end with some brief notes on implications that we see moving forward. So, the study. First things first, we were invited, I guess specifically Dr. Catherine Lugg was invited by Dr. Catherine Marshall to the Politics of Education Yearbook, a special issue examining neoliberalism and how it arises differently, and we're similarly in many different states, and so was out looking for specialists for each state, and Catherine Lugg was asked and invited to be the New Jersey representative, and she kindly invited myself and Atiya Strothers onto the team, and so we were tasked with investigating neoliberalism as it arises in New Jersey's educational political context. Neoliberalism at its heart is a preference or a tie to market-based or private-based alternatives or solutions for educational or schooling problems. And what we found, the concepts that we latched onto to help us make sense of New Jersey's context in particular is a conceptual, I guess, idea called crony capitalism that's been used notably by Joseph Stiglitz to understand, to make sense of how friends, private interest friends, and those relationships, when nurtured over long periods of time, tend to funnel public goods away from the public towards those private friends. And so we looked at these concepts and how they play out and don't play out in Newark, New Jersey in particular. And again, to find data on the neoliberalist politics in New Jersey has been a challenge. Not least of which because following Fort Lee and a few other scandals, the Christie administration has shut down its communication avenues, forgetting a lot of what should be, in some cases, even legally required data that are just not available. And so we've had to engage in a great deal of scavenging, looking to both, expanding out of both your traditional sources of data, such as traditional media, the Star Ledger, official records of data, to non-traditional sources of data as well, blogs, local media, local informal media sources, as well as some of the social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat, which we'll get to in a moment, which was itself a bit of an adventure taken together with a very strict page limit for us, so that was fun to play with. So first things first, why don't we go through fiddle with buttons?
So we want to take a look at Governor Chris Christie and kind of explore how he ended up into the place that we started to investigate. And so I was tasked with his election as a governor, and most importantly, looking at this timeline. And so what you'll see is that Governor Chris Christie was a freeholder of Morris County in 1994, prior to his appointment that is shown up here in terms of 1999. And so after his appointment as the freeholder, he was in this 2-year partnership. And so during that partnership is where he actually harnessed a relationship with Chris Cerf, who is connected to Edison Learning. And so following this, the reason why this is very important is because as you look through these political ties, this is where actually the relationship really starts to happen. And so what you'll see later on down the line in the case study that we investigated in Newark actually starts here in this place. And so Chris Christie is one that is very loyal to his team. He is one that, where this term crony capitalism comes from, his cronies are very, very important to him. So as he navigates these 3 different spaces, then going into U.S. Attorney for New Jersey and then taking office as governor, he starts to forge these relationships and political ties with persons. And then what tends to happen is that he then incorporates them within those politics and within those spaces. And so the strong ties that he's had with Cerf pushed a voucher expansion program that will ultimately cost the state more than $800 million. And then after taking office as governor in 2010, he brought with him some of his closest confidants, as I've stated before. So now, as we're moving forward in terms of the public education pensions, here's a quote from Christie that says, "I will protect your pensions. Nothing about your pension is going to change when I am governor." And so a lot of persons within that place were made that same promise based upon other governors as well. And so there was a deal that was made in 2011, and then Christie then went back on that deal in 2014. And so we start to kind of see the different politics at play. We start to see how he's forging these relationships, which pretty much lays the framework for the case study in Newark. Yes, so we talked about the cutting the funds by $280 million, lobbying for salary freezes, and then the changes within superintendents. And so when we consider again how he pulls in different persons within these spaces, we're able to see the change and the shift that actually happens, which takes us to Newark.
So within the state level politicking, in terms of who gets positioned into governmental positions that then get translated into educational solutions, educational politics, we took as our illustrative case study Newark and recent events surrounding now ex-former Superintendent Cammie Anderson's implementation of the One Newark plan. So first things first, looking at Newark and why it might be a fitting location for us to do this kind of an examination, particularly with these 2 conceptual frameworks, or conceptual lenses. Newark, New Jersey is disproportionately low income and non-white when compared to New Jersey writ large. So it's more non-white than New Jersey. It has a lower median household income than New Jersey writ large, and has more residents living below the poverty line than the state as writ large. So what you start to see is, in the midst of New Jersey's electoral politics, where you have different degrees of voice, of political voice, located in suburban school districts when compared to urban districts. Newark, New Jersey clearly seems to fit in the latter category when we look across indicators of race and class. In addition to this, Newark, New Jersey is an Abbott district, which means following over 20 state-level rulings wherein the state was it was affirmed that the state was inadequately funding Newark schools. Newark was just taken over wholesale by the state in '95, which means the state has, and state actors now have, direct control over reforms in the district, over the policies in the district, which translates into local residents, the people who live and work in the schools, no longer have direct authority over how their schools are being run. One example of which are with how superintendents are appointed, wherein superintendents in an Abbott district like Newark are appointed through collaboration with the governor's office directly, where they appoint someone, and through the approval of the state Board of Education. And part of what this translates into is that the local board in Newark kind of becomes more of a symbolic body, wherein it doesn't have direct authority over the workings of the district. And so we'll pick up our analysis in June 2011, where Cami Anderson was appointed through this process, through these actors who, are not directly connected to those who live in this community, as the superintendent for Newark on behalf of New Jersey. Her qualifications as cited at the time were her prior experience with Teach for America, her prior experience with New Leaders for New Schools, as well as her prior experience with District 79 in New York City, which is a district primarily constituted by alternative schools and some charters. And as you see here, you see patterns of someone with experience with Friends and People Christie and private companies, private expertise that Christie has prior experience with, getting suggested or suggested for appointment to the position as qualifications for the kinds of reforms that these bodies sought at the time. So in Newark, starting in December 2013, the One Newark Plan is introduced by the Anderson administration. In particular, and I won't run through a lot of the details, but because I'm more interested in the voice piece, I think that shows the neoliberal aspects of this a little clearer. However, it doesn't really make sense unless you know what the voice is about. It proposed school mergers, renewals, and closures, effectively replacing many public schools with schools run by charter companies that were pre-approved by the governor and the governor's office at the outset of the plan. This translated into a disparate impact that affected primarily schools that served low-income and non-white students within the district, when compared to schools that serve less higher income and more white students. It recommended the removal of almost 30% of the teachers, and importantly, also recommended replacing many through some of the same programs that have long-standing connections with both state actors, Anderson and Christie, and that shift as well has been shown to have had a disparate impact on primarily non-white, disproportionately on non-white teachers. In addition to this, professional development and avenues specifically for seeking reimbursement for professional development also became more limited to specifically programs that have the exact same ties to these private interests. So you could go to your state school for professional development, but you couldn't seek reimbursement for it. In addition to this, and this became really part of the most long-standing controversial part of this, it replaced the neighborhood school system where you went to the school in your neighborhood and proposed to have parents rank their schools in terms of preference, and then would on its own place students there. The details were not released to the public as to how those placements were done. I don't want to do this. So by January, by the following month, following vociferous concerns from the community in the traditional political spaces in the monthly board meetings that are designed to engage in this kind of political dialogue about educational policy, Anderson promptly gets up and leaves. It was vociferous, to be fair. It was both like. It was fairly aggressive feedback from the community. This meeting follows a no confidence vote by the Newark board. Anderson leaves the meeting and very shortly following releases a letter saying she will no longer attend the state mandated public board meetings, effectively obstructing one avenue for communities to voice their concerns about how their schools are being run. Ultimately, this what ultimately became formal policy translated about a year later into similar minimalist communication with lawmakers in Newark, when lawmakers in Newark started to ask questions and details specifically on this, as well as teacher hiring and budgetary concerns. The Anderson administration refused to meet until they were subpoenaed in November, and then the following month eventually did attend that meeting. So at this point in time, by January 2015, what we see is four obstacles to the traditional ways communities can take voice in terms of how their schools are run. The first is relatively unresponsive communication from Superintendent Anderson in ways that similarly match the Christie administration's minimalist communication, specifically regarding educational issues at the broader level, which informed our data collection issues. In addition to this, having state control in Newark effectively means the community doesn't have any direct representation in terms of how their schools are organized or run, in terms of what kinds of reforms are unveiled and planned. In addition to this, the local board, which is your traditional space, with whom you communicate those kinds of issues, is effectively symbolic at this point, post-Abbott. In addition to this, what we've seen historically, this happens simultaneously with effectively a reporting vacuum in Newark, where what used to be the Newark Star Ledger, a flagship periodical, has shifted from an urban locale into a suburban locale. In addition to that, the local public television station was removed to New York City and Montclair, and there is a broadcasting booth in Montclair State University. So many of your traditional avenues to seek redress or to gain broader public awareness about issues have also been obstructed or simply moved at this point in time. And so in the face of these obstacles, what we see are community members coming together, voicing if vociferously, their concerns about how this One Newark plan is to be implemented at first, and then afterwards is being implemented once it was put into place. One example of this is when we see a community meeting held at the Hopewell Baptist Church, importantly organized in part by Ross Baraka. And so what you see is you see community voices, parent voices, getting together and collaborating with local political voices. And during the same meeting, 4 principals stand up and testify to longstanding historical reallocations of resources and talented teachers from primarily low-income and non-white wards to wards that are less so within Newark, as well as their concerns about the One Newark plan specifically. And so here you see not only community voices merging with political voices, but you see educators' voices uniting in resistance to this One Newark plan. And what that translates into is a very quick response from the Anderson from the Anderson administration, wherein within 48 hours, letters were distributed suspending the principals. And then a week following national media for about a week, they were all eventually relocated if they desired to be so. So come November, following this meeting, wherein afterwards, after the board meeting that month, it became official policy, the administration's official policy, that there was going to be minimalized communication. It was going to come in the shape of a formal press briefings and at least one instance, a 40-minute video describing One Newark to the community in the face of all of these obstructions towards being able to voice concerns about how your schools are run. And it becomes known within the community that Superintendent Anderson, after not making all of the meetings between January and here, is scheduled to speak at the American Enterprise Institute, an organization with a long-standing history of favoring reform, private market-based reform, similar to the kinds of reforms that the kinds of groups that Cami Anderson has prior history with. And so 40 parents and students charter a bus, purchase tickets, and decide they're going to go to Washington, D.C. 4 or 5 hours, depending on traffic, I learned yesterday, to voice their concerns in a location outside of Newark, New Jersey. And so once they arrive, they're there for a little while. Eventually, an announcement is made that the presentation is going to be delayed. After further waiting, another announcement follows, reporting that the speech is going to be moved 2 floors below and will be given without an audience. So again, you see a continuation of obstructing avenues for voicing concerns about how schools run and the kinds of connections and charters that are being brought in instead of vetting those individual charters individually. Most importantly, for this story, I feel, the students become the story for the reporters in DC. Notably, the students are reporting to reporters, and it eventually makes it to print, wherein the students are voicing feelings of isolation from their schools and they're mirroring the frustration that their adult colleagues are also attempting to voice in this space. And so, investigating this student voice moving forward, in February of 2015, 10 students formed the Newark Student Union and organized a 4-day sit-in at Superintendent Anderson's office, demanding answers to the same very basic questions that adults, educators, as well as local politicians have been voicing, as well as Trenton's politicians have been voicing for months up to this point. And notably, they use social media to broadcast this. They use Snapchat, which I will admit, I like my Twitter and what have you, but I had no idea what Snapchat was before I found my way into this project. As student voice explicitly joins with parent voice, with political voice, as well as with educators' voices in challenging and requesting information and resisting the One Newark implementation, we see again a very quick administrative response. It's a very similar pattern. At first, legal counsel for the administration comes out, labels the students trespassers, and orders them to leave. After that moment gets broadcast through the social media and translate into not just national press but international press. What we see is council comes back out, and these last two happen simultaneously. The students are promised food, they're promised access to water and restrooms, and that they are, of course, allowed to be here and express their concerns. You are, of course, allowed to have your voice here. But simultaneously, uniformed police officers were sent to the children's homes with letters expressing the interest that they should come and pick up their students from the superintendent's office. So a few months later, so again, resistance to these voices, attempts to, right? So again, a few months later, the Newark Student Union organizes a walkout. Hundreds of students leave their schools, walk down the streets, obstructing traffic, walk down to City Hall, and they give speeches outside of City Hall. They give prepared statements to the press outside of City Hall. And most notably, following this event, they pick up, they throw away trash, they walk back into their schools. The local reporting, there's an interesting distinction here that I think is worth sharing with you. It's also in the paper, obviously. Local reporting from the Star Ledger, right, initially seeks out the commuters that were being obstructed. And so they juxtapose the student speeches, right, with the same amount of text space in the articles, with interviewing the commuters that are being obstructed. And they ask, or initially, the first few responses are to questions that were about how do you feel about having these students obstruct your commutes, followed by once the commuters have the situation explained that students are demonstrating against the One Newark plan, they want more information, and they're testifying to long-standing state control as well as a historical lack of funding in the district. I think it's telling that the commuters' responses shift to, well, the students seem to be fulfilling, and I quote, their democratic duty, end quote, which is a powerful shift between how they're being portrayed by different groups. The Newark Star, the former Newark Star Ledger, the editorial board, ultimately calls many of the groups that were resisting the One Newark plan, quote, political crazies. So you see a powerful juxtaposition here in terms of who's allowed to share voice, right, and how that voice is met and or received by state-run educational actors. Okay, so looking at this story all together, I think this quote sends a powerful message, a message that illustrates the relationship throughout these events between state-run actors and those who live and work in the schools in the Newark Unified School District. I don't care about the community, and this is in response to a question about vociferous resistance to the reappointment of Cammie Anderson as superintendent of Newark by the community members that live in Newark. We run the school district in Newark, not them. And so looking across all of these stories, I think there's a handful of lessons or implications that related to how neoliberal educational politics seem to come to the surface and are enacted in educational politics, specifically in Newark here. The first is that there seems to be a two-track political strategy here in terms of approaches to communication with suburban primarily non-Abbott districts and your overwhelmingly urban Abbott districts. In addition to this, so you see different avenues for becoming educationally political agents, depending on where your district lives. In addition to this, crony capitalism in New Jersey politics, there seem to be 4 trends here. The first is there are longstanding relationships, not just in the governor's office, but also in terms of who gets appointed through those mechanisms to make the decisions about what Newark schools look like in Newark. Was I covered that? The use of minimalizing communication as a tool to manage resistance, I think, is a powerful, is a potentially important pattern that comes out of these stories this historical narrative that we've constructed. In addition to this, these happen at a particular moment in time wherein there's been an erosion of traditional media sources, which have historically been avenues for exposing the broader electorate to issues of importance to you within your own community, as well as the lack of the lack of direct control over how your schools are run. In addition to this, I think there's a less depressing lesson or implication here as well, in that committed, sustained counter-networking, wherein voices of many stakeholders, including youth, including students, when they merge and they map onto one another and unite, can change and alter the course of educational policy making in these same spaces. In particular, when we saw parents, educators, and the now mayor of Newark come together, we saw a powerful moment of change. In addition to that, when student voice got added to this, and in particular, when public opinions in traditional media seem to have flipped, were when substantive and creative avenues for sending out those voices, right, through not only these sit-ins and these stand-ups, but using social media, right, where traditional media may not give you the exposure for these issues. So it is possible to shift educational policy making. And in addition to this, just because I do some work on the side with this kind of scavenging, we were only able to collect this data because we were empowered through this methodology to look to non-traditional sources in addition to traditional sources for where people are taking their voice, where traditional political pathways for resistance are obstructed. Thank you.
Oh, silence.
I'm going to grab water if that's all right.
No, you go first. Okay. So I have two questions about methodology. So the first of all, you just talked about the empowerment of scavenging as if other qualitative methods might not allow you to go to these sources. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think there's many texts that qualitative researchers read this data. And so I'd like you to comment on that. And the second thing is I want to know how you looked at the text. Like, I think that it's really important that we read these different texts and they can be read in multiple ways, right? Mm-hmm. And so there should be, I'm just interested, did you have a methodology in how you read those texts that others might be able to use?
Yeah, great. Set this down. So to start with the first part of your comment, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are many qualitative methodologies that empower educators to, and bricolage is the one that comes to mind, right? To look towards both traditional sources within a discipline, but also to draw across disciplines. Particularly, what I found applicable with scavenging, particularly helpful there, was it's particularly attuned for pulling out data on marginalized, historically marginalized populations, and drawing across, and doing so drawing across disciplines in a way where it's okay to be a little disciplinarily incoherent in terms of the ultimate arrangement of specific methods that get used. And so that draws from primarily my familiarity with the queer literature, with queer research, and where scavenging has its original home. And I draw all the way back to the 90s with J.J. Halberstam's work on that. And so with the second part of your comment, which see, now I got all excited about Halberstam's work.
I'm just interested because I was at a paper session that I was in a couple of days ago, and they looked at non-traditional sources as well as me to really talk about universal pre-K. And you know, there's another story within just this, because we've been in public preschool classrooms in New York dealing with some of this lovely policy. So, but they had a very clear, explicit methodology of how they looked at the texts, and that's what I'm asking. So, did you use your rhetorical devices? Did you use the notions of discourse? Just did you look for issues of power? You know, because there's some naysayers out there, just a few, that would say, you know, this is a lovely story you've made up, right? So sort of like So, I mean, how did you develop the evidence trail is what I'm saying. How, it's one thing to collect these things, it's another thing to really
To analyze
look at them critically, yeah.
We were primarily guided by the concepts that we were granted for the piece as a conceptual framework, as a lens for making sense of where they arise. And so within the scavenging literature, there's an impetus to look towards, because it's queer literature, right? That's where my background is, queer mentions, right? And so we were looking for mentions of these politics where they did rise to the surface within the traditional reporting that happened, as well as what I like about the scavenging piece is it encouraged me to look elsewhere, right? In a way that bricolage might, right, as well. So it wasn't that I sat down with a critical discourse analysis framework, right, and looking for kinds of clues and codes from there. But in terms of how I made sense of the data that we did collect once we find it, I did use two forms of coding. I just didn't present it here. The first were, you start with your really big codes like neoliberal, right, and crony cap with the friends, and then the primary actors. Right, so TFA as well as Christine Anderson, as well as I in the beginning had a code for parents and educators. Students came into that. Yeah. Right. As you were reading. Yeah, exactly. And so that kind of emerged out of it. So I would submit to you that might be my second kind of code.
Okay.
If that makes more sense.
Just to add to the discussion, I think that one of the advantages of scavenging is the fact that it provides validation to stories that will otherwise go untold. And so I think sometimes we are in positions to provide a qualification to certain things that have that qualification, but when it comes to other populations and other notions or backgrounds of other things, they are not in position to provide or have that same qualification or validation. And so I think that in addition to what Jason has said, is that we're now in position to tell these stories, to share certain things, and sometimes that is all that is really needed and is necessary.
I want to follow up on your point, because you can see that play out, particularly with how the Star Ledger handled this narrative around Newark, which was one of derision and dismissal, whether it was the adults involved or particularly the kids. And so what scavenging does is says, well, the Star Ledger is trying to exert its own political power to kind of, and they had this really interesting alliance with Christie up until about last year when this year when Christie's presidential campaign blew up. And so Atiya's point about, Newark particularly viewed from Trenton, the white elite of Trenton and the white elite of New Brunswick, etc., is historically viewed with a fair amount of skepticism, if not derision. And I think to some extent the Christie administration got trumped by the politics because they just underestimated the networking power of the local community. But the Star Ledger in particular, I trained as a very traditional historian. So you use the official sources, which you couldn't get, and all the newspaper sources you could find. Well, if we had just followed down that traditional path, we would have been telling a very different story on Newark. And since my humanities base, that's why Jason and I, the key, and for Atiya as well, College Stamp is that door for historians and philosophers and wayward qualitative researchers.
Whoever wants to talk.
Okay, so thank you very much for presenting. I'm really interested in your use of, I just had oral surgery, so I'm like, okay, but I'm really interested in your use of neoliberalism and capitalism, in part because I think there's sort of a paradox, and I want you to talk about it, which is that with neoliberalism, we see like a retreat of the state, like market forces are sort of determining the flow of resources and social relationships, but really what we're seeing here is a consolidation of privilege and state power, in a sense. So I wanted to know if are you using crony capitalism as like a local manifestation of neoliberalism, or like I'm interested in like the paradoxes of it, or the internal contradictions at the heart of it. Does that make sense to the question?
Yeah, I think so. Unless
Do you want
someone
me
to talk.
Sorry,
Sure.
I'll bump in on this one. Neoliberalism, as presented by neoliberals, is a very technocratic approach, very technocratic, in that it's all about using market mechanisms to get better outcomes, whether it's educational policy, health policy, what have you. But when you actually see it play out, and this is why Galbraith's work was so interesting, because what you actually see is that when people try to implement market-based solutions like the former Soviet Union, what you start seeing is just this wide open crony capitalism corruption through the mechanisms of both private enterprise and their alliances with the state. And so the state power also becomes corrupted through the market mechanisms because of the disincentives for political act, for other people to critique the state. And so we get this on a very small level at Newark, where you don't have voice and where liberal solutions have been brought in with almost no fight back from the community because the community is so disempowered, is Camden, where you have even more neoliberal market solutions to the Camden public school system. And because of the deals made with George Norcross in South Jersey and the South Jersey Democratic machine, the residents of Camden are really going to be left to fish. So, and we could have, this could have easily, we could just talk about neoliberalism and educational policy
New Jersey.
in New Jersey and have a book, because there's just so much of this stuff going on and all the connections. Atiya's work, and this is a lot of it ended up in the cutting room book, all the connections that Christy had to the private school community, and then legal folks giving, costing the state to give Christy legal advice. It just went on for days. And having friends isn't a bad thing, but it's just in public government, in a Republican democracy, a democratic republic, you're supposed to be open and accountable to everyone, not just your buddies. Look,
What was the question?
I like the law, I like courts, because, when people get angry, we get lawyers and we sue, as opposed to grabbing guns and killing each other. It's a step up. But yeah, there are some problems of access and accountability that are deeply public.
I'm just trying to go through who had hands for a while as they swing around. Yeah.
All right, so I know that a lot of the sources that you tried to get were from the community, but I'm wondering how your data collection varied with Christie's presidential campaign and the Bridgegate scandal, especially as, WNYC, the NPR station, had, they started Christie Tracker blog. Is in the state? How much money is the state losing due to this law? All of these things, Matt Katz's book, all of his lectures. I'm wondering how the outside watching affected your data collection. Was that helpful? Was it hurtful? Did you not pay attention to it?
Well, did we pay attention to it explicitly? It's a lot of that oversight, right, has translated into a dearth of data, of officially sourced data that in prior decades, right, or even just prior years, right, might have been more readily accessible, right? And so for a lot of data that just should be publicly available, right? FOIA requests need to be submitted, and responses to FOIA requests end up getting delayed, right? So you can start with official accounts, right? And you find a lot of the official accounts reflected in your traditional media sources. Right, when they're not being provided by the state, but when you want to provide voice for historically marginalized communities and they're not being represented there, right? You need to also look at elsewhere.
The other thing is we had 18 months to write this. So 18 months, 26 pages. And that included all the references.
Yeah, I know you've had your hand up for a long time, and then we'll swing back around.
So, I guess my question is, so the issues around the state and the local in Newark certainly didn't start with Christie, right? Goes back many years. The idea that protesters against the power structure get marginalized and, treated like crap, that's certainly happens in lots of places. And the fact that one picks associates who certainly happens as well. So I guess my question fundamentally is, what is it particular about Christie, neoliberalism, and crony capitalism that makes this story different?
One part of it is that that was the task that we were invited to take up, was to play with these concepts in this particular context and see and see what arises from that in terms of lessons, especially in dialogue with this counter networking piece, right? With resistance to the ways that neoliberalism rises to the surface or is constituted nationally. So it's my understanding that that's what the broader piece is playing with as well.
Yeah. The other thing is, we were to look for specific examples, that were neoliberal at play. I would say that Christie's administration is just so blatant, and their targets are selective. They're the added districts. They could have easily tried to go after Tom's River because Tom's River, like Newark, has a history of spectacular corruption. Their former superintendent is in Club Fed for probably another 10 years because he was such a crook. And that's a gateway for state takeover, having that, systemic corruption. But let's look at the demography of Tom's River. It's the largest, I think it's the fourth largest district in the state, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Republican. The former district was, superintendent was connected to Christie. I would say, having connections can help, they can hurt.
Sure, but what's the flow of the money? I mean, at some point, like, there are people who adopt neoliberal perspectives that actually have genuine belief that this is the way to solve it, right? You have Newark that has historically had lots of troubles, right? So saying that we need to fix something is not an unreasonable solution. So what, crony capitalism has a pejorative term, concept, right? So what makes it a bad thing? And I'm not arguing that what they do is good. I'm not, championing Christie. But I am saying that in making the search case, how do you kind of separate? In other words, there's one thing sort of saying he's in bed with Sir and they're friends. There's another to say that actually Edison benefited X millions of dollars because of that relationship. That starts to, I feel, it's like there's a capitalist exchange here that actually is a little unseemly. And I didn't hear that.
Is there something unique, special about New Jersey and allocation of power and the structure of the government that makes crony capitalism makes it particularly vulnerable?
People have looked at state political cultures for years, and New Jersey has a political culture that whether Democrats have been in charge or Republicans have been in charge, this is more likely to happen in New Jersey than most other states.
Okay.
And the original Hudson County machine was Democrat.
Yeah, and let me follow up on that. I had a student who did a history of casino gambling in Atlantic City public schools. And he actually gave me a nice little history of Atlantic City back to the Dutch. And Atlantic City was founded when the Dutch made a deal with the Brits, and it was a crooked land deal. Now that goes back to the 1630s. So to some extent, this is centuries of culture. The faces change, the people change, but you have this long-standing, older than the American Republic of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do see, just kind of get into a couple of points that were put out. the people that Christie did bring on as he started to go higher up in the political chain, their investments also started to go higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. And so you do see this kind of exchange of power in politics and money and funds that are then being distributed to his cronies per se, and then eventually leading to their resignation or leading to their overthrow within the positions that they're in. The other part that I wanted to make is that we asked the question of what makes this story different. And so the charge that I would say is, if it's not different, why can't this story also be told? And so when you connect the scavenging piece to telling the story, to providing and adding qualification, getting back to what Sharon was saying, in essence, what we've done is we've taken this set of data and this story that has yet to be told in the state that we currently reside in, to now provide and add qualification to something that will otherwise go unqualified. And so even if it's not different, I think that it is still one that provides something that needs to be added to the discussion. Yes.
Sorry, I was gonna actually kind of like chime into the conversation a little bit in terms of like, we can see capitalism, of course, as like a political economic configuration, but it's also a social relationship, and it's also like a way in which people relate to one another. And so I think what this does is it doesn't trace the money, right? But it maps the social relationships that then consolidate power or disempower or allow people alternative routes to protest. And so I'm just saying it like that. Like, I'm not saying that the money's not important, but I didn't interpret this, the point of this as being like the flow of capital. I interpreted this as being like the flow of like immaterial sort of resources / like relationships that are embedded within capitalism. Does that make sense?
But we also did track some of the money, we just didn't throw it out
Right.
into the discussion.
Yeah.
You know, again, you're gonna hear me gripe for the next couple of months, space limitations. 26 pages, actually 19 pages typed, and then the references.
Yeah, so my question for you is, where do you see this going? Because to me, when I hear what you have to say, it's like a narrative about the power of capital to change social relationships, as Steve is saying, right? In this like social space, and I think, you know, the story is happening elsewhere too. So I'm wondering, like, where you see this going? Is this a narration about what happens when things that belong to the public become privatized, right? And the state that is supposed to function for the public good gets harnessed by capital, basically, right? So, I mean, I see a court case in this, right? So, I mean, where do you see this going? So.
Do you want to start? Like, in terms of where do I see different community group stakeholders taking this, or where do I see?
Yeah, I mean, what could happen, and you know, the potential for community voice is something that's, I mean, it's so important, you know, for communities to have voice, right? So I'm talking about the perspective of someone who works with language, right? So, yeah. So that's really important. So then, what, you know, like, how can this be used?
I think there's a powerful message here, or I hope there's a powerful message here that is a little distinct from the brunt of a lot of research on inequalities, especially when you get into talking about politics and power and money, where the stories tend to get very dark and the lessons remain dark, right? And there's no hope. All hope is lost. We can't. And so that translates into, and I see it with my students, right? It translates into this belief, this mistaken belief that, well, there's nothing I can do. I can't fight this big power, right? And so in terms of thinking about, and you, I think you hit the nail on the head right at the end, Jesse, talking about, well, there's potential here, right? There is still space to be created, to be made for counter-organizing, right? And there's power there. And there's power there not just because of, no, I think I'll leave it there. I think there's power there, right? And I think that's, as a queer scholar, I'm always thinking about, okay, so what's the alternative, right? In terms of how do you, this is taking voice where traditional avenues for voice are being obstructed as part of official policy. And so to realize and have an awareness that there are other trajectories, right, available as well. They may not be easy, right? And they might require a whole heck of a lot of collaboration across a whole heck of a lot of stakeholders, as you see even in Newark, right? But they're there. There's potential. It's my all is not lost kind of the internal optimist.
So just to comment further, it sounds in some ways similar to a story that happened in Arizona when the state legislature got involved in curriculum and banned bilingual, bicultural education in Arizona. And students did a march to Tucson, and ultimately this terrible legislation passed, right? But bicultural, bilingual education did not stop there. The students who were involved in this movement started having bilingual book fairs, and they traversed the state. And it's actually like a Latin tradition, from what I know. The tradition of having ferias happens in spaces where there's not like institutional access to books, right? So this was like continuing that tradition. But anyway, the thing is that the students went across the state and creatively reconstructed, access to bilingual, bicultural education. And that was sort of an underreported story, right? As well in Arizona.
Yeah, it's heartening in some ways. I think in some very important ways that you're recognizing some of these patterns that we uncovered just in this short piece, right? Elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't our intention to make a broadly representative argument about politics in general, even neoliberal politics in general. So that's hard.
I'm surprised you didn't mention anything about Facebook money, because I can't think of any other glaring example of neoliberalism / crony capitalism in New Jersey, in Newark, than the Facebook money.
Yeah.
But try to get documents on how it was spent.
Bingo.
And that's, the things we run up against.
Consultants, and that's your whole crony capitalism there, because all the money went to consultants.
I'm telling you,
Yeah, well, she worked for the Ledger.
No.
no, the Times.
The Times.
So I don't know this methodology of scavenging. I do know something about media, and I think looking for evidence of queer identities in spaces where being queer was a lot more dangerous than it was even in North Carolina today. But how do you prevent, when you're scavenging, becoming part of the echo chamber that is the internet news? And what I mean by that is, right, I was in the news business when we went into Iraq most recently, and there must have been, 5 big reports that we found Saddam Hussein. And how that starts is somebody leaked to some news source, usually Fox News. Fox News just reports we found Saddam Hussein. And then every other media outlet would report Fox News reports that we found Saddam Hussein. And then it would just go around and around and around as that report, even though it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But it becomes this echo chamber of, rather than anybody corroborating anything that's factual, of these things getting reported, because you can kind of say, well, so-and-so said, as opposed to getting multiple reports of these things. So I'm curious how you dealt with avoiding just becoming part of the echo chamber.
I would say honestly dig deeper, quite simply, and I say that because it's very similar to doing oral history. And so the project that I'm doing is an oral history project on Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor, right? So for example, I've been told time and time again that Proctor was a phenomenal mentor, a phenomenal scholar, which, you know, I went into the thinking that he was, and I still think and believe that he is. But what the other piece that you sometimes don't hear is that he was also called an Uncle Tom, and that he wasn't as forceful in nature that maybe some of his other African American peers. Right. So there's this flip side of the story that now you're getting into it. And so as you're talking about, which I think is a really good point, as you're talking about going into something and you're trying to escape the media, I think that you have to, again, dig deeper. I think that you have to remove yourself from that context as much as you possibly can. And so when you're going into these projects, you have to kind of force yourself to do so. And then at the same time, you also have to make sure that you have sound advisors that can kind of check when you're going into a certain area that is, you're falling into what the media or what the narrative says. And sometimes let it sit for a while, you know? And so I think that within this, we've allowed it to sit, but at the same time, we've captured different versions to try and find the truth, because in essence, that's what we share. So.
To highlight one of Atiya's points, having 3 people on the project was absolutely helpful, because you could craft a story from one location of sources, right? And you have other eyes to help you try to find disconfirming evidence. In addition to that, the fact that there are so many, when we could find, and there were many incidents throughout these stories that we left out, and many that we left out of the paper because we were uncomfortable with just like worried about something similar. We weren't. I didn't have the words echo chamber in my head, but with validity concerns, right? And having multiple bloggers with different positionalities, having multiple people with different positionalities throughout this mechanism, reporting, right? Was also a helpful way to gauge truthfulness, right? Or in Colbert speak truthfulness, but that's a different meaning. Does that speak to your question?
If I can ask one other quick question, I'm sorry, I didn't know if anybody else. Cory Booker is not mentioned in your story. So I know part of that was probably he's not part of your story. But by his omission, what I hear based on this is he was complicit at a different level.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about where was Cory Booker?
Do you want to go? In many of the sources accounts of these events, he wasn't on the surface for where we were looking for a handful of these, or the ones that we shared, absolutely. And in addition to that, we were looking at, or I was primarily looking at, who was present in those moments, right? Because that was that was one of the lenses that I was interested in. So Ross Baraka's presence as an organizer kind of was much more present in the narrative than other people. And that's not to say Booker isn't present again. This is a short paper.
Right.
So we have to cut out a lot of actors. Like I think the interactions with the chief talent officer and some of the educators are telling. We just don't have space. Is there anything?
The only thing I would add is that the reason why I told Jason to go first is because of a personal connection with Cory Booker. And so it's, and I think it connects right back to the question you asked previously, which is really great, and trying to make sure you create this disconnect as to certain things in media and avenues that you're gathering information, right? And so Jason's absolutely right. When you look at, in terms of the documents we found, or the videos we found, or things we saw, Cory Booker was not just allow, he was not present there, right? But again, where's Cory Booker, right? And so, you know, we all know he's there. But it's drawing this separation to kind of add that and throw it in there. So I could not put in the paper, well, so-and-so said, you know, X, Y, and Z, because, you know, you have to be able to make sure it's valid and you're keeping things in context as to how you're pulling out that data.
Oh, we're over. Thank you very, very much for bringing up this really cool and very, very pressing issue here in New Jersey. Next week we have Ravik Goen-Duncan, who will be discussing learning progressions in science. And thank you all for coming. And I know most of you are very, very tired.